Hi, I am Tim Cook, and this is video 3 of the training on business planning in West African marine protected areas, organized by the Réseau des aires marines protégées d'Afrique de l'Ouest, and delivered by Baastel Consulting Group and BlueSeeds. In the previous video, we explored the need to properly finance marine protected areas. Here, I will explain how to use a business plan tool to analyze the financial data of your MPA and calculate your financing gap. So we've seen that to be effective, meaning to achieve their preservation goals, marine protected areas need to be able to deliver protection. And we've also seen that for this, they need the resources, staff, and budget. So in other words, what they need is financial sustainability. And for protected areas, financial sustainability can be defined as the ability for a protected area to secure sufficient, stable, and long-term financial resources, and also to allocate these resources in a timely and appropriate manner to cover the costs necessary for the effective and efficient management of a protected area in accordance with its conservation objectives. Unfortunately, constant and sustainable funding is not the reality for most marine protected areas. MPA revenues vary a lot over time, as this figure shows, and they often depend on short-term sources of financing to fully implement management plans. As you can see here, the aimed financing should be rather constant. However, in this theoretical model of the funding of an MPA, we see that the variation over time is quite significant, which can threaten some of the conservation activities of the MPA. I think that nobody here considers that conservation should be thought of as a business. However, as we've seen, conservation is underfunded, so we do need to think of it in a cost-effective way. We do need long-term financial planning. So what is a business strategy and how can this apply to a marine protected area? Today we can define a business strategy as a strategy that does not just involve increasing revenues, which also involves building the capacity to manage resources well and meet the needs of diverse and changing stakeholders, and do this both now and into the foreseeable future. So what does long-term financial planning for a protected area look like? Well, it looks like this figure. This figure was taken from the Guide on Financing Mechanisms for Mediterranean MPAs, currently under publication by BlueSeeds and the MAVA Foundation. And the first step here is to plan the future costs of your MPA, which are needed to reach the conservation objectives in the management plan. The second step is to assess your past and present sources. Third step, you need to plan your future revenues, and if the difference between your costs and your revenues is positive, it means you have a financing gap. The fifth step is to try to reduce this financing gap by reducing your costs. You can also try to review and optimize your funding sources to reduce this gap. Finally, this may not be sufficient, and you will need to implement new financing mechanisms for your marine protected area. Presented differently, you see that the 7 steps of the financial planning roadmap form a system. This is because building a financial strategy is an iterative process. The strategy is constantly revised until the financing gap of the MPA is close to zero. Where do you start? You start with a management plan. The management plan is the Bible of your MPA because it contains all the objectives that need to be reached and thus the activities that need to be implemented to reach the conservation objectives of the MPA. So from here, you can plan future costs, and by assessing current financial resources and future revenues, you can assess your financing gap, which is the difference between costs and revenues. Now, if the financing gap is positive, meaning you have a financing gap, well, there is the possibility to reduce your costs. However, if this is not sufficient, it is possible to change or increase your existing funding sources or find new financial sources for your MPA. And so you see here how this is an iterative process. Every change in the system will affect the financing gap until eventually, hopefully, there will be a moment when the financing gap is close to zero, which means that your financial strategy is a good one. In this training session, you will learn to use a business plan tool that will help you develop your financial strategy. The tool you will be using is the MPA Business Planning Matrix that was updated by Baastel Consulting Group in 2021. The tool is based on the Simplified Guide for Business Planning for Marine Protected Areas by Benjamin Landreau and the MedPlan Business Plan tool developed by Thomas Binet and collaborators from Vertigo Lab. It is an Excel file containing 8 sheets that we will discover how to use in this video. So let's take the financial planning of your MPA step by step. Step 1, plan your future costs. Now, before you do that, you need to make sure you have a management plan for your MPA. As I said, the management plan is the Bible of your MPA and defines the conservation goals of your marine protected area. So before you can plan future costs, well, using this management plan, you need to define all the activities that are necessary to reach the conservation objectives which are found in that plan. And then, for each of those activities, you need to evaluate their costs to be able to evaluate all the costs which are needed to reach your conservation objectives. So the first part of planning your future costs is to define all the activities that are necessary to reach your conservation objectives. Now these can be diverse, and here is a table presenting different categories of activities, but not all types of activities are necessarily presented here. It's an example showing you the main type of activities that you need to think about when you do this listing. For example, management and protection of natural resources, which include many types of activities like control and enforcement, or research, monitoring, mooring maintenance, or habitat restoration, or even the management of cultural resources. Another big group of activities is education and awareness raising programs, which include different types of activities like education or information of the general public, or even the development of livelihoods. Another group is tourism activities management, for example, concessions and special uses, visitor safety, or visitor education. Extractive activities management can be a very important activity, including fisheries management or other extractive uses. Administrative management, very important and sometimes overlooked. It includes planning or general administrative management, financial management, stakeholder engagement and partnerships, or IT activities. And finally, exploitation and maintenance facilities, not to be overlooked either. Facilities for boats, for example, buildings and lands, paths and roads, or even underwater trails. It is important to stress that during this phase, when you are listing all the activities necessary to reach your conservation objectives, you need to be as detailed as possible. For example, if you are listing the enforcement activities like MPA patrolling, you literally need to think about every type of equipment needed, the human resource, and the occurrence of this activity. For example, you might need one boat, fuel, how much, and binoculars, how many pairs of binoculars do you need? Human resources, how many people, 2 rangers, for example, and the occurrence of this activity, 2 patrols a week, for example. Now that you've made a list of all the activities that are necessary to reach your conservation objectives, you need to evaluate the costs of each one of those activities. Taking the example mentioned earlier of patrolling, this activity has costs, which can be put into different categories. First, investment costs. You might need to buy boats, 2 boats, one costing 15,000, another model, more expensive, costing 28,000. You will need staff, of course, human resource costs, 2 experienced patrol officers, costing you 42,000 per officer and per year. And finally, there are recurrent costs, like the maintenance for the 2 boats, the boat's fuel expenses, or insurance costs. So now that you have listed all the activities and associated costs that are necessary to reach the conservation objectives in your management plan, you can start using the business planning matrix. After having entered in the first sheet of the tool general information about your marine protected area, you can start entering your costs. In sheet 2, shown here, you enter salaries. For permanent staff, you need to enter the yearly salary and the number of job positions with that salary. For temporary staff, shown in another table on this sheet, you enter the monthly salary and the number of months. In both cases, the total payroll is automatically calculated. You repeat this for as many years as you can, typically over the next 10 years, or for as long as the management plan runs. A hypothetical factor of salary increase over the time is included, which can be changed. After you've entered the costs for salaries, you need to enter in sheet 3, shown here, all your recurrent costs planned for the coming years. These include diverse operational costs, like the expenses related to water consumption and electricity, or the cost of fuel. In another table on this sheet, you can also include the costs of maintenance of equipment and facilities. Now that you've entered your recurrent costs, in sheet 4, shown here, you must enter your investment costs for large equipment and infrastructure. This is where you enter the costs of buying a new boat, for example, or a new car, or of building a research or a visitor center, for example. Finally, in sheet number 5, shown here, you must summarize the management objectives listed in the management plan and list for each one the costs of these activities, but only those costs which have not already been included in the previous sheets, therefore excluding salaries, recurrent costs, or investment costs. Otherwise, these costs will be counted twice. For example, for surveillance activities, costs linked to the salaries of rangers or to the organization of patrols like fuel or boat maintenance should not be included here. Here, you should enter costs linked to reforestation activities, for example, to research activities like inventories, to costs of attending conferences or costs of making signs, for example. In short, any cost that cannot be entered in the previous sheets should fit here. Sheet number 6, shown here, gives you a budget overview with a figure that is generated automatically as you enter costs in previous sheets. It allows you to see in one glance how the costs evolve over time. It also allows you to assess the relative contribution of the different activities to the overall yearly costs. In year 2024, costs in this example are expected to be highest because of the purchase of large equipment. You can notice how salaries in blue and recurrent costs in gray are relatively constant over the time considered in this example. Okay, so now that you've planned your future costs using the activities that you've identified in your management plan to reach your conservation objectives, you need to assess your current financial resources, which means assessing your known past and present revenues. So what kind of revenues are we talking about? Well, your MPA may have different types of revenues. It might have government revenues from local authorities, government revenues from regional authorities or from the central government. It might have revenues from international donors or NGOs. It might have revenues from the private sector. It might have self-financing mechanisms. And it finally might have donations. So all these different types of revenues need to be carefully listed and put together in a table. Now, the third step to the financial planning of your MPA is to plan future revenues. You need to assess your future revenues over the same period of time as used earlier for the cost assessment phase, which is the period of time of your management plan. And future revenues can be both a continuity of existing revenues as well as new sources of funding. Whatever the type of future revenues, they all need to be listed carefully. Now that you've assessed your current and future revenues, you can enter them in the business planning matrix in sheet number 7, shown here, like you did for the cost assessment phase. Beyond calculating your financing gap, this phase will help you assess the number of funding sources, your dependency on some sources rather than on others, and the funding trends. Is a revenue constant, declining, or increasing? Now, the fourth step to your financial planning is to assess the financing gap of your MPA. Now, this is really the easiest part because you've done all the work. Now that you've entered the total revenues and the total costs to reach your conservation objectives, the financing gap will be calculated automatically by the business plan tool. So enter these revenues and enter these costs, and the business plan tool will calculate automatically your financing gap. The business planning matrix automatically calculates the financing gap of the MPA in the last sheet summarizing its financial needs, sheet number 8 shown here. The different revenues per type of funding category are visible at the bottom of the figure in colored areas. You will notice that project fundings from donors in yellow end in the year 2028 here. The costs correspond to this black line, and therefore the financing gap is the difference between the two and corresponds to the white area shown by the black arrow. In this example, the MPA is projected to have no financing gap in the year 2027. The financing gap is otherwise always positive, meaning that the MPA is almost always lacking funding resources to reach all of its conservation objectives. So to conclude, assessing the financing gap will allow you to estimate the effort which is required to close it. And in this way, it will be possible to identify various measures to be put in place to fill this gap. And we will see these measures in the following videos. These include reducing the costs or optimizing your revenues, but also identifying new financing mechanisms for your marine protected area. Thank you very much for your attention. Analyzing the financial data of your MPA with the MPA Business Planning Matrix may seem like a straightforward, if not even a simple exercise. However, it must be done seriously and thoroughly if you are to properly assess your MPA's financing gap. Only after this step can you begin to try closing this gap. In the next video, we will explore ways to reduce costs and optimize revenues. See you soon.